Okay, this is our final review video for the first exam. We're going to be talking about the second version of the argument from evil. So the original version of the argument from evil that we talked about in the last video began with Mackey's claim that a perfectly good being will eliminate every single evil that it can. What we saw is that that claim is susceptible to counterexamples, and rather than casting aside the argument from evil in its entirety, the thing to do is to see whether that principle can be repaired in order to avoid the counterexamples. That is, maybe there's a more nuanced or sophisticated version of the principle that takes care of or avoids the counterexamples we discussed. And what we came up with was this version. This version of the principle says a perfectly good being eliminates not every single evil that it can, but every evil that it can eliminate without doing further damage. Those are the evils that a perfectly good being will definitely eliminate. There may be other evils that a perfectly good being will leave alone, specifically the evils that it can't get rid of without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good, or the way we'll put it is an evil that it can't get rid of without doing further damage. Those evils it's not going to touch. Once we revise the first premise, because subsequent steps depend on the first premise, the argument is not going to be valid anymore unless we revise subsequent steps so that it still validly follows from the new first step. When we look at, we can keep our second step, which said if God exists then God is perfectly good. This is part of classical theism. But now what follows from 1 and 2 is not that therefore if God exists then God eliminates every single evil God can, but rather that if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. Those are the evils that God will eliminate. If there are some other evils that God can't eliminate without doing further damage, for all our first principle says God being perfectly good is going to leave those alone. We're going to leave steps 4 through 6 the same. Remember that on your handout, there's a slight difference there. So if you weren't there in class, on your handout, there's some blanks where right after 4 and 6, you can just put a period at the end of what's written there and ignore the blanks. And then instead of revised B2, you can just keep B2. We're keeping 4 through 6 the same. An omnipotent being can eliminate every evil, still plausible and true. 5, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, still true. And 6, therefore, if God exists, God can eliminate every evil. Still follows. We will, though, have to revise 7, because when we now look at what we have at steps 3 and 6, at 3 we have, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. And we know at 6 that if God exists, God can eliminate every evil. But that doesn't tell us which evils God can eliminate without doing further damage. And so all we can infer is basically exactly what's written at step 3. All we can infer so far is that if God exists, then God is going to get rid of every evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. That's all we know, because we don't yet know which evils God can eliminate without doing further damage. What this means is that when we look at step 8, previously what followed from step 7 was, therefore, if God exists, then there's no evil at all. Because before step 7 said, therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil. But now all we have at step 7 is, therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. So at step 8, we can no longer conclude that if God exists, there's no evil. Instead, we have to conclude that if God exists, then there's no evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. There's none of that sort of evil. There's no unjustifiable or gratuitous evil. It's the way we put it in class. And then finally, our conclusion is going to remain the same, therefore God does not exist, but we have to fiddle with step 9 in order to validly conclude that God does not exist. Before, in the original version, step 8 said, therefore if God does not exist, then there's no evil at all. And so all we had to say was, well, and there is evil, from which it followed that God does not exist. Now, though, it says at step 8, if God exists, then there's no evil that God could get rid of without doing further damage. And so merely observing that there's some evil doesn't tell us whether that's the sort of evil that there shouldn't be if there's a God. we have to then specify which sort of evil there is, and it's the kind of evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage, or the way the theist will put it is, there is evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. That is, if there is a God, there's evil that God could get rid of without doing more damage to the world. Another way to put this is that there's gratuitous or unjustifiable evil. Evil that is unnecessary, evil that could be gotten rid of from the world without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. From those two, it does follow that God does not exist. Because at 8 we have, if God exists, then there's no evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. And then 9 tells us, but there is evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. Therefore, God does not exist. This is the completed revised argument from evil, or RE. You should know this in addition to the original version. And you should also know that what we've done in revising this argument is made the first step basically airtight. We don't have to worry about the first step anymore. But now the 9th step is open to controversy, because the 9th step tells us not just the obvious claim that there's evil, but it tells us that there's a particular kind of evil, namely the sort of evil that could be gotten rid of from the world without doing any further damage. And the question now for the atheist is, why think there's that sort of evil? I could agree that there's pain and suffering while not seeing why I should think that it's gratuitous, or that any such suffering is gratuitous. Maybe it also serves some purpose. In class, we discussed 2 defenses of the claim that there is evil that if there is a God, God could eliminate without doing further damage. And one of them was Rose Fawn. You don't have to know that one for the test, but it was an interesting discussion we had in class. It's a bit more of a direct argument. The more complex, but in certain ways more powerful argument is Mackey's omnipotence defense. So what Mackey does is he says, look, I think that the theist in particular has reason to think that the evils there are, some of them, are gratuitous. Indeed, I think that Mackey's argument could conclude that every evil is gratuitous. And he thinks that this follows from the theist's commitment to the nature of God as an all-powerful being. So this is why we're calling it Mackey's omnipotence defense. I'm going to lay out the defense of RE9 in a step-by-step numbered premise way. You should definitely know Mackey's omnipotence defense. It's really important for understanding the dynamic between the theist and the atheist. Here's what Mackey says. His conclusion is that if God exists, then there's evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. And I'm going to come back to that if God exists part and how that connects up with RE9. So keep in mind that that's what he's going to try to conclude. His first step in his argument for that claim is another claim about the nature of omnipotence. He says this: an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. Another way to put that is an omnipotent being can eliminate every single evil there is without doing further damage. Why? Well, the thought is an omnipotent being can do anything. So among the things that it can do, it should be able to get rid of paper cuts without taking off the ends of fingers. It should be able to rescue animals from suffering without removing the opportunity for heroic action on the part of people. The being should be able to do anything. So it should be able to get rid of all evil without causing further damage to the world. Second, if God exists, then God is omnipotent. This is just part of classical theism. From 1 and 2, it follows that, therefore, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil there is without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. And that follows from 1 and 2. Now add to this third step the following pretty uncontroversial claim. There is some evil. Now when we look at 3 says, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil there is without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. 4 says there is some evil. It follows that if God exists, then God can eliminate the existing evil, the evil there is, without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. And that's just a longer way of saying that if God exists, then there is evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. Which evil? Actually, any evil you pick is the evil that God could eliminate if there is a God without doing further damage. So that's Mackey's omnipotence argument. And notice that we have a conditional conclusion. If God exists, then there's evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. And you might be like, well, I thought 9 said that there is evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. It didn't have that if bit. The reason why Mackey is comfortable concluding the conditional version here is that he's targeting theists. And so really, all he has to do is get the theists to commit themselves to the conditional that if God exists, then there is evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. Because the theist believes that God does exist. And so the theist will then have to conclude that there is evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage, and that's just step 9. In a way, Mackey doesn't have to accept step 9. He just wants to convince the theist to accept it. So that is the dynamic here. And Mackey thinks that he can prove, and he has proven from claims that are definitional of theism and claims that are definitional of omnipotence, that a being like God, an omnipotent being, must be able to eliminate all evil that there is without doing further damage. Now, we talked in class about which of these steps a theist might want to go after, and really the only one that seems open to challenge is this first step. This claim that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. The way that I'm going to present, and the way in class I presented the theist's reply to Mackey's omnipotence defense, is in a few steps. So I'm not going to lay it out in a deductive step numbered premise kind of format. Instead, I'm going to a little more informally present it in just 3 steps. The first step involves the claim that there are higher order goods. So the theist's opening salvo in response to Mackey is to say, I reject the claim that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. Why? Well, first, because I think there are higher order goods in the world. What are higher order goods? Mackey defines these as goods the existence of which logically requires the existence of some evil. And notice that this isn't just causal requirement. So it could be that in order to get fit, you have to go to the gym. That's not like a logical requirement. You could imagine somebody poof popping into existence already really fit without going to the gym. That won't ever actually happen, but it's like logically coherent. It's conceivable. It's imaginable without contradiction. A higher order good is a good the existence of which, by definition, requires some evil. We talked in class about some potential examples of higher order goods. Courage, perhaps, by its very nature, might require the existence of some danger. Generosity may require, by its very nature or by definition, the existence of some need or lack. Compassion may require, by definition, some pain with which the person who's compassionate identifies in some way or takes compassion on. And then finally, historically, the most important example is that of free will. The claim is that in order, by definition, for someone to be free, they have to have the option of doing wrong. If they don't have the option of doing wrong, then they're not really free. But if they have the option of doing wrong, then inevitably at some point they will go wrong. And if they do go wrong, they'll do so by harming someone else. The idea is that it's logically impossible for creatures, human beings, for example, to all have free will, but for none of us to ever harm one another. Why? Because that would amount to there not being free will. That's the idea. Now, with that in the background, the theist then says, okay, I think that some goods there are logically require the existence of certain evils. I think there's some higher order goods. They then say, let's see if we can get a little clearer and just be a little more careful about what omnipotence is. Remember that omnipotence, the way we initially defined it, was the ability to do anything. And the theist isn't quite going to say, I need to change my definition, although I'm going to give you I'm going to call it Omnipotence 2.0. Don't think of it too much as like changing the definition. Think of it more as the theist saying, I'm going to clarify what I originally meant. When I said that omnipotence is the ability to do anything, I meant that omnipotence is the ability to do anything. In other words, the omnipotent being is able to do any possible action that is an actual action. So here are some things that an omnipotent being, if it's really omnipotent, certainly should be able to do. Moving a big desk, moving a mountain, turning water into wine, creating the universe. Here are a bunch of things, as we discussed in class, that an omnipotent being in some sense can't do, but doesn't really seem to count against that being's being all-powerful. An omnipotent being can't lamp dog pony, can't slithy toes, gyre and gimble in the wabe, can't make square circles, can't make 2 + 2 5, can't make married bachelors. But those aren't things to be done. Those aren't even describing possible actions. Some of those are just nonsense. They don't even express a thought, like lamp dog pony. So obviously the ability to do anything didn't mean the ability to do lamp dog pony, because that's not a thing. Nor did it mean the ability to make 2 + 2 = 5, because although there are, that's like grammatically correct in a way that lamp dog pony wasn't, that also doesn't express a logically and mathematically coherent thought. We also are going to throw in there that omnipotence was never, according to the theist, meant to include the ability to eliminate every evil without also eliminating higher order goods. The concept of eliminating all evils while keeping the higher order goods is a logical contradiction akin to lamp dog pony, akin to square circles. Why? Well, because the concept of a higher order good is one that cannot exist without some evils. So the idea of eliminating every evil without eliminating the higher order goods is effectively the idea of eliminating every evil and so thereby getting rid of the higher order goods too, because the higher order goods logically require the evils, but yet keeping the higher order goods. In other words, it's the idea of both eliminating and not eliminating the higher order goods at the same time. But that's a contradiction, just like making square circles is a contradictory concept. So what is the difference between the things that we think are in the scope of omnipotence, traditionally understood, and the things that are not in the scope of omnipotence, traditionally understood? The way to carve it up is that traditionally theists have thought that the ability to do anything is the ability to do anything that's logically possible. And it is not the ability to do logical impossibilities. So Omnipotence 2.0, again, this is more an unpacking of what was originally meant, what the theist originally meant by omnipotence, more so than a providing of a new definition. The theist will say, okay, let me be more careful. When I say the ability to do anything, I mean the ability to do anything that is logically possible. And now steps 1 and 2 come together to give the theist a plausible basis, I think, to deny 9.1. 9.1, remember, said that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. The theist will say, well, some of the goods that exist are higher order goods. Free will, courage, compassion, and so on. Moreover, an omnipotent being can't do the logically impossible. Here is a logically impossible thing. Eliminate every evil without also eliminating the higher order goods. Why is that logically impossible? Because if there were no evils, then neither would there be any higher order goods. And so eliminating all evils without eliminating higher order goods is the action of both eliminating and keeping higher order goods, which is a contradiction. So an omnipotent being cannot eliminate all evil without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. Why? Because an omnipotent being would thereby be both eliminating and not eliminating the higher order goods like free will. Does that make the being not omnipotent? No, any more than the fact that an omnipotent being can't lamp dog pony makes an omnipotent being less than omnipotent. What was meant by omnipotence was the ability to do what's logically possible. The thing for you to think about, among other things, is one, whether the higher order goods there are actually greater goods. Are they worth it, in other words? Because that's important. And the second thing to think about is whether it really is logically impossible to eliminate all evil without also eliminating free will, for example. In other words, is something like free will really a higher order good? Could you conceive of a set of creatures who were free, but who never use their free will to harm one another? Or would that be not real freedom? That's the kind of thing I leave to you to think about, as well as puzzling over Rowe's fawn and whether you agree with William Rowe that we can see the gratuitousness of certain evils given the information we have.